Hi, welcome to this online conversation between myself, H.G. Masters, and Marian Pastor Roces about her book of essays called Gathering Political Writing on Art and Culture, which was produced by the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design in Manila and published in 2019 and is now being distributed with the partnership of NUS Press in Singapore. So that's why we're here. So I'm joined with Marian herself from Manila. And so I'm going to just introduce a little bit talk about the book, and then Marian is going to read a passage, and then we will just have a short conversation. But at any time, if you'd like to send in questions via the Facebook page, that would be great too. So thanks for joining us. So with me this evening, Marian has been writing since the early 1970s, writing critically about art, cultural institutions, their manifestations of power, and the forms of art that can kind of resist or stand in exception to, let's say, colonial or modernist ideas of high art. Then over the course of this incredible time span that is captured in this book of essays, Marian has worked for various cultural organizations, including the Cultural Center for the Philippines. And then she went on to become a researcher and scholar of indigenous textiles from the Philippines and Indonesia. And since 1999, has been a museum consultant, curator, and designer through her own company called Tau Inc. And some of the museum projects that she's worked on have included the UP Manila's Museum of a History of Ideas, the Uchengo Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design, as well as a project called the Museum of Indigenous Knowledge, which I believe is still in development. So the book, Gathering, I can hold it up for Gathering comprises 40 essays collected starting from 1974 all the way through 2018. And I would say that these essays span a wide range of topics, from the Philippines art scene to more thematic reflections on forms of culture, national identity, modernity, conceptions of Asia that were in a discursive sense emerging in the early 1990s, and that your interest in engaging with has continued. And as well as textiles, the study of languages, and the politics of beauty. So collectively, this book, Gathering, is really a conversation about theories of culture that in some ways are specific to your milieu, but I find that we as readers, or myself as a reader, that these conversations are really urgent and applicable to lots of different fields and lots of different conversations and geographies that are happening at the moment and all over the world. So I find there are lots of recurring interests in your essays, as well as the kind of depictions of a disjuncture between a cultural scene in the Philippines and the rest of the world, and then also within the Philippines itself. And you really understand and portray across these essays how cultural organizations and institutions are sort of projectors and facilitators of forms of political power. One of the other things I have to say about this book is that it's a real delight and pleasure to read, and that's because of your very unique voice and style. And people who have known you longer and in more contexts really also appreciate this fact. So in the introduction to the book, the dramaturg and cultural theorist Rustam Baroka, he explains how and why this book can be considered a gathering. And he says he really attributes that to your what he calls absolutely relentless, no holds barred commitment to critique, and also your very distinct voice, which he proposes kind of marries a kind of classical writing voice to a kind of speaking voice. And he boils this down to saying that your voice refuses to be disciplined, and he describes it as saying things the way they need to be told, and to hell with academic propriety. So if that's not a selling point for this book, I don't know what is. The person who spearheaded this book, the MCAD's director, Joselina Cruz, she also notes a similar thing in her introduction, in her publisher's notes. She says she evokes really the first time she heard or encountered you speaking, and she was really captured by how your, what she says, your provocative ideas were couched in an extraordinary language. So, and I think language remains a really important part of not only the things that you discuss, but how you discuss them. You know, and for myself as someone who writes about art, you know, I'm very compelled to see and to experience like new ways of talking and writing about art that sort of escape kind of either magazine style writing or kind of academic style writing. So, and for me, reading your works for all of these decades, you know, it's really kind of is an inspiration. So I thought we should allow, since the real star of the show is you, to let you read some of a passage from one of your essays, and so that people can get a sense of your style and personality. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Marian.
Thank you, A.G. I wasn't aware that it was a style at all. But, well, that's one of the things that you're not aware of when you're writing.
Of course, yeah.
So at the start, before I read, I do need to, this is not just a thank you, because this book would not have been possible without really 2 years of work of a group of people around that were formed by Joselina Cruz in MCAD. And they are Sam Marcelo, who is an excellent editor, and Jay Yao, who is the book designer, and Marian Pernia, who ran after all of the essays. I'm sorry that this sounds like, you know, the big thank you, but I'll tell you why this was utterly important. The essays were published all over the world, and it was published as early as the 1970s and all through the 80s, and it was really nearly, to me, impossible to find them. Many of the publication houses were dead. The sheer labor of tracking down more than 40 essays all over the world and asking for permissions from whoever was still alive, that took some doing. So it is with a great deal of gratitude that I should like to begin any discussion with this book. All right.
Great.
So the title of the book is Gathering, and I stole this word. I stole it before in 1991 from Homi Bhabha. So those of you who are familiar with Mr. Bhabha and his theoretical work would recall Gathering. Well, I took it because I was trying to name an exhibition that I was putting together at Griffith University of Australian Art. And I'll read from what was the catalog. This was an effort to explain why I stole the word. So gathering, it's not collecting, it's not amassing, it's not foreclosing, it's not harvesting, not a lusting after, not a social gathering, the bourgeois institution, not the creation of a defined collective. Rather, it might be a summoning up of energy, of thoughts, of wits, with meditativeness, but also urgency. I gather that in quotations is not the same as I know. It might be a receiving of additions, the creation of mass, although perhaps not quite bricolage. Yet it might be a keenness towards concealed knowledges, that I'm very interested in concealed knowledges. Two, there is a death, as when one is gathered up to one's ancestors, whoever they may be. A storm gathers, like an ominous swelling, or a momentum with no clear trajectory, possibilities in the charged chemistry of a site. Includes making, gathering is to draw together folds and wrinkles. In bookbinding, it is to take a group of leaves, imagining and insisting on an order. The same word has female and male inflections, neither of which is essentially liberating or essentially oppressive. Gather carries only a spectral recollection of gathering as cosmology. Hunter gatherer. Yet gathering seems to be always vis-a-vis a threat. Gather the clothes. A storm is gathering. I'll end there.
Thank you, Marian. Thank you. Maybe you could describe just the context of this larger essay and where it goes from there. It's also quite a unique edition or format.
Yes, I was on a fellowship at Griffith University, Griffith Artworks, and they have a collection of Australian art essentially, but it also goes into the Torres Straits Islands. So part of my fellowship was to actually curate an exhibition with the incumbent curator. So we co-curated. Since my knowledge of Australian art was, not deep at that point, I we constructed a brochure where Beth Jackson, my co-curator, would put in one paragraph and I'll put in another paragraph. And so we gathered these two voices, as it were, to construct the catalog. So I was actually rather pleased with the fact that we didn't have to be inordinately knowledgeable of something that we were probably not interested in taking full ways into scholarship, but that an exhibit was possible with a curator who didn't really know the collection beyond about 3 months of studying it. So that was the exhibition.
I also was thinking about the book as a kind of gathering of multiple
Yes.
conversations that you yourself have been having. I mean, maybe with other people, whether it's Homi Baba or fellow colleagues who are fellow artists, friends, but also almost in a way with yourself.
Yes.
Because they span such a long time. So one of the things that I was wondering was if in the process of gathering all these texts together, you had really noticed a kind of evolution of your thinking, or is evolution maybe not the way to think about such a large body or works, or also span of time? Do you see it more as like an elaboration, or how have you been thinking about it?
I'd like to answer that question, I suppose, a bit further on in our conversation, if I might actually postpone that. Sure. Because when the book was getting done, gathered, and we were already in conversation with the two individuals who were going to write the introduction to the book. So that's Elena Rivera Mirano, who's a dear friend of mine, and Rustum Barucha, the dramaturg and theorist who lives in Calcutta. And they read everything. They went through the entire thing, and it is a privilege, of course, at the end of more than 40 years, to have such close reading. This truly is it's a different feeling. Now, what they got out of it was a major experience for me. They got different things. So Elena Mirano looked through the whole thing, and she ended the introduction with a sentence that says that I have been writing about death for since the 1970s that death was the actual running thread for 5 decades. I didn't know that. So to realize after close reading from another individual that you were actually doing something that was I was totally unaware of, then that's where the writer actually begins to think that you've released something of yourself that you didn't even know was there.
Yeah.
And so I begin with that, and I'll go to Rostom in a minute. I begin with that in order to say that sometimes we're not conscious about what we're doing. I mean, we're doing one project after another project, and then it's 5 decades, and then now you let someone go through it, and something emerges that resonated with me. I think it is true. Now, Rustum, you read a bit of what he had to say about undisciplined, and I fully agree. Um, Rustum, another dear friend, he seems to have burrowed his way into wormholes. I'd use the word in my texts, uh, as I apparently transited between one language to another. And in many ways, the first word that comes out of anyone's mouth about my book is about language. And there's just multiplicities of languages, not just languages, but languages within one person. And not just bilingualism, but different inflections, different dialectical variations. And Rustum appears to have followed me through those wormholes between languages. And each language apparently, of course, I was trying to describe this, but being described by another human being was pretty spectacular. How each language is a different architectural space. It's a different brain space. And it's not just, different species of things, but the variation of difference was pretty vast. And I hadn't realized that I was describing the transiting from one language to another, the actual transiting. And the reason I believe that it was perfectly possible for myself to do it is because I am very aware that I come from a culture that is quite oral. And so my facility with written language is certainly not as fluent as my facility with orality. So this is the reason why I didn't think it was ever a style. You are actually speaking, when you speak to me, to a person whose background culture is an oral culture. And it has a different, I find, for instance, that if I had to give a keynote, um, and those things are performances, I write it by hand because it has a connection with my brain. If I write it for publication, I write it with a computer. So these are different parts of the brain functioning, I think. So yes, it's what you're conscious of and what you're not conscious of. I hope that answers the question. I'll go to your actual question in a bit. I'll have to stop here.
No, I mean, personally, I think that's true for all of us. Inevitably, if looking back, you find certain threads, of things that you did when you were much younger or earlier in life that, obviously led, or they blossomed, or you explored them in more depth over time. I mean,
yeah.
But maybe you could explain how, at least to my perspective, you've done a lot of different things with your professional careers and with your energies. So maybe you could explain how writing has worked in tandem with or cohabited with those different other practices of yours.
Well, I write. I am an independent curator. I have made museums and exhibitions in different parts of the world, in different parts of the Philippines. I do. I am a partner in a think tank, so we do policy work, and I am very politically active. So there's a lot of political work in my life. When I think about all of this simultaneously, I realize that As a curator, I have to find a way outside text because writing is text. Curatorship is space, and you can't privilege text as you deal with the physicality of space. So that's changing now, but spatial comprehension remains a rather important part of curatorship. Now, policy work is a projection into the future. It's an imagining of a space in the future, a space in which life can transpire. So that's different from text. That's actually like a kind of wishful thinking, which is what policy work is. So the first thing I'll have to say about the relationship of writing to the other things that I'm doing is that I'm very conscious that I don't want to privilege text in the same way that I don't want to privilege text because I would like to give due honor to oral cultures, non-literate cultures. So there's that. But since all these areas of work, curatorship, policy work, political work, they all require a critical imagination. And the infrastructure of critical thought, the implicatedness of work today, in criticism with work in the past, in criticism, is text. And in this respect, resisting text is absurd. So I might say this, and this will sound heavily theoretical to you, but it really is not. What I have found productive is the struggle itself to figure out these matters, not once and for all, but repetitively for every project. What is the relationship with text and this space? What is the relationship of text with this particular policy area, which has to do with the lives of very poor people, for example? So it gets rerun. It gets rerun. This trying to figure out the relationship with shifts. So, in sum, all this means, and in practical terms, all this means is that the privileging of text to me must be resisted by myself, perhaps not other people, and that the absurdity of it must be made productive.
I mean, I think that's part of the pleasure or like joy that one experiences in, and I think this is what Rustam is really, one thing that he's really pointing to is that because you don't, I mean, I don't necessarily see this as, I mean, I think what you do that's interesting is you bridge orality and the written word without like, you know, even for myself, like I don't talk the way I write, you know, there's a much bigger, like this kind of Western education where we really learn to write in a voice that is not our spoken voice. So for me, and I think this is what Rustam makes the point of, is that you really collapse the two in a way that is very, very engaging and pleasurable because it just gives you access, like you feel in closer proximity to you as the writer because it's this voice that is coming from a place that is, you know, in a way closer to your actual person, you know, rather than the sort of formality of a lot of, especially more academic or more, you know, the kinds of texts that accompany a lot of cultural activities or, you know, museums or, so for me, that's a certain kind of pleasure.
Well, there's pleasure for me. And there's pleasure in language. I might also add that you mentioned that I also talk to myself, and there are many selves in each of us. So I'm not certainly privileging my own positionality in my own culture, but the reason I decided to write one essay where I talk to different selves is because those different selves have different languages. And they do talk to each other, and I'm sure you recognize that. But that's fun.
Yeah, I mean, you obviously created these. I almost didn't want to give it away, but I mean, there are these, and it is very playful. Like you know, the many sides of and the many incarnations of yourself, and the way that your friends can recognize them and appreciate them and see them as distinct. I think is a very developed and nuanced sense of self, or cultivation of self, that on the one hand, at first might strike someone as, from the outside, yeah, but it's absolutely, then it sounds wonderful, and you start thinking, well, yeah, sure, I do the same thing. I'm one person with, this group of people, and I'm another person in a different context or in a different professional role, and so why not embrace these multiple selves and voices that we all carry around?
Well, I'd like to jump in and say that I've began to theorize it over the last perhaps decade, that identity itself, and identity politics tends to kind of spiral downwards into some original self or some more authentic self than the other selves. But then, in fact, as it plays out in human lives, there is so much negotiation between and among different selves. And I do find that the politics itself of identity will privilege oneself over another self depending on the circumstances and methods of empowerment and self-empowerment you choose.
Right. Do you think then you would answer this question about whether or not over time your thoughts about certain topics have kind of evolved? Or I guess what I'm trying to ask is whether you think, or whether you noticed in the course of gathering text together, whether you saw them as an evolution of topics or just more of like a deeper exploration of them over time.
Definitely. Not an evolution, a kind of rupture. About criticality. Of course, when you're young, and I was young in the 70s and in the 80s, and you study your positions and you develop your arguments. And I fell into the trap of figuring an ethical way forward into a text or into a curatorial project or into a political project, with the need to determine what you think might be destructive and avoided or renounced, denounced, rejected, embraced. You make those decisions in criticism. I hadn't realized until much later how dualistic, how binary that is. I have a deeper appreciation of the folly of that kind of dualism. It is biblical, and in many senses, that kind of Manichaean dyad from the Abrahamic religions, obviously to which I was born, has to be outgrown, I think. So how did I outgrow it? About 15 years ago, I began to take Deleuze seriously. A particular line, lines of light, the Deleuzian lines of light. And I began to recognize the ethical need in criticism to look at a desolate landscape, a malignant landscape, and to try hard to find lines of light. Because if you see things as black and white or east and west, then it's not rigorous enough. It's not strategically good, and it doesn't exercise. It doesn't exercise what needs to be exercised when you come to actual political engagement. So yes, to find the subtlest traces that might embody potential. The potential or the possibility of emancipation may be nearly invisible, but we need to find those in every malignant situation, and to find in any situation that looks happy, the things that may be unhappy in them. So I've changed in that respect. There's another way, and it's related, that I've changed, and so it's a rupture again, from that binary positionality. And I'm by no means talking about being things being all relative. Of course, I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about, for example, the book Empire by Negri and Hart. I'm sure you're familiar with it. I find the two authors to be overly romantic, but I did get something from them that I have actually taken as a life lesson, which is that there is no outside position. There's no outside position. We are in empire. It has no center. It's deterritorialized. The flows are here, there, and everywhere, especially now. And you do not have an outside. And you'll just have to figure out your critique as embedded within it. That's a fundamental change in the way I've been thinking, and it happened about 15 years ago.
From my perspective, also one way that I thought I saw you experiencing, or maybe this is another rupture or a related rupture, was this idea or interest that you developed in craft, and which in certain essays you really put in opposition to practices of fine art in a way that, for me, drew out a lot of the contradictions of and problems of just what you were talking about, this kind of, let's say, happy situation. Like, if the happy situation is modernity and development and, cultural funding and cultural institutions and, an art scene, you really find a really rich universe of very important and, for you, obviously very gratifying cultural production that just doesn't fit into these other sort of discursive paradigms or philosophical paradigms that you also were coming out of. And that I feel this real strong sense that this was also a kind of release or way, like a line of flight towards a different way of thinking about culture.
Indeed. But when I made that jump, and it was with a dear friend of mine, the conceptual artist Judy Sibayan, we both plunged into traditional textile research after beginning our, as it were, our youth in art with conceptualism, and with the 1970s avant-garde in the Philippines. Not in search of some kind of romantic roots, but as a disturbed soul, as disturbed souls, about, in fact, the binary between art and craft, which I've always felt was onerous, the binary, because, as you know, this is institutional, and you know that it comes from the Renaissance. And it comes from an understanding that craft has nothing to do with the brain, wherein art is supposed to be driven by hard thought, like science. Now, I'm not prepared to take a look at a fabulous ikat textile and think that it is the work of hands without a brain. That it is simply insane to think of such artistic production as the craft, and that it should remain until the 20th century, until now, should be, well, we should inveigh violently against this categorization. But as you know, the institutional categorization of art and craft is to do with funding. It's to do with what museums do what. There's a lot of problems with assigning everything to ethnography and then assigning another set of things to fine arts. I think that the taxonomizing technologies deserve serious attention, more serious attention than we've not exhausted serious attention to the taxonomies. But it's a hard slog. It has taken me nearly 50 years to to find a project in which I could actually construct an accession record, a museum accession record that does not include that taxonomy in the DNA. And I have a project right now where we're going into the creation of the accessioning system and the categories of accessioning, and what is this, what is that, what do you classify as ethnographic, what do you classify as contemporary art. Now, this is not nihilism. This is not collapsing boundaries. This is simply thinking hard about taxonomies and political implications in marginalization and the creation of dominant groups of people, and the art system, in which a lot of trafficking and a lot of money is being made on the taxonomies. So as you can see, you've actually pressed the button here. I'm actually quite passionate about the taxonomizing systems.
Well, I mean, we also, in our own ways, when we're stuck in, like, let's say, more narrow discourses, we tend to just take these taxonomic systems as being, quite small and useful,
Yes.
Without looking at the larger system that they're a part of, and also how they function in them. So, in my context of sort of contemporary art, if there's a contemporary museum in the Philippines that is showing modern art, that's great. But, we tend to just focus on what the art is and what, the projects are and its history, but we don't tend to connect it in the ways that you do in your writing to, the political power structure, toward the struggle for a national identity, or the discourse over the struggle for a national identity. So this is another way in which, I found the craft aspect that appears early on in your thinking and writing to be a very interesting one, because you're so interested in this 1970s era Marcos regime project of the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and because you worked there, you really know the institution, and you really saw it from the inside and in a way participated from it. And then so your arrival to craft is a kind of liberation from this. And then also through that, you find language. You can really see how you become interested in trying to find new ways of talking about craft, in the same way that craft exists outside of modernist taxonomy of culture. You realize that there's no language for craft. So then in your essays, we get to witness you looking, ruminating, thinking, exploring these different words that, through the many sort of the polymorphous languages that you, in a way, can draw on. We get to witness you thinking about that. And that is also very interesting to think about, how language really, of course, is the basis for these taxonomic systems. So once you want to get away from the taxonomy, you also need to go out and search for a new language.
And a new taxonomy, which you do not, for a moment, presume will be liberating for the rest of eternity. These are constant things. But what I'd like to say is that I would not have been able to think about language, taxonomy, words, without an early introduction into conceptualism. And this is what I mean by it actually feeds into each other. I simply do not think that I could have rethought the category craft without conceptualism, without being 20 years old and listening to the music of Jose Maceda on 20 cassette recorders at the same time. So yes, it was an education that went around from contemporary art.
Maybe then I should mention that, or I can ask you about this, because the very last essay in the book is called Conceptual Art, Authoritarianism, 1970s, Asia. So in a way, it very nicely encapsulates all of these interests that you had sort of very early on in your writing, but then, of course, it brings us into the present. So it looks, you make this comparison between the Cultural Center of the Philippines and the projects that were happening more or less contemporaneously in Iran, with Farah Diba and her sort of modernist state project and her interest in contemporary art of the 70s and the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art. And
right.
so, but I mean, I think the interesting thing is that what you try to make a deeper point about the ways that culture functions in, let's say, iniquitous or unjust social contexts. I mean, you go beyond this idea of what you say, that culture is not just window dressing for fascism, but that there's something about how fascism in these contexts, this is your term for it defanged modalities of thought and creative ways that can take stock of authoritarianism.
That's right.
So
that's right.
I think that kind of reflection on the things that happened, now 40 years ago, is of course really relevant to keep in mind again, because we're facing this sort of new wave of authoritarianism, in different ways and in different manners all over the globe. But there's definitely this return.
Yes, there's definitely this return. So let's go back to that period, because I think that to discuss the Marcoses and the Cultural Center alone inside the Philippines, well, that brings you some ways, but it doesn't bring you very far, I think. The 70s was just at the tail end of the Cold War. It was still the Cold War. There was the Vietnam War that was going on, but at the same time, there was a band of dictators all over the world. You had Pinochet at the same time. You had everybody in Southeast Asia, including Pol Pot, at the same time. You had mass murderers at the same time, and you knew that this was embedded in a geopolitics of all the Cold War. Now, in this context, a lot of avant-garde movements erupted in the courts of the dictators. And this is quite personal, as a matter of fact, for me, because I spent my first years of work as an assistant curator at the Cultural Center. It was just 3 years, but in those 3 years, from 1974, I met Rudolf Nureyev and handled Francis Bacon paintings, and you get calls about is it possible to buy a Michelangelo from Malacanang Palace, from Imelda's people. And you had this traffic, Van Cliburn. And then one day, and this is another essay in the book, I met Hossein Valamanesh from Iran, in Australia. And he had the same experience of meeting this traffic of international stars in Tehran. And so it is impossible now to think of what transpired in the 70s outside the geopolitical. And how do you then think of the imbricatedness or the complicity of art? But we can't think of the complicity of art in very simple-minded terms. We can't say that just because Xenakis was in Persepolis, that he was complicit in the regime of the Shah of Iran, of Reza Pahlavi. It's as a matter of fact, there is at least one very rigorous scholar who is doing an archaeology of Shiraz and Persepolis and what transpired there, and that a lot of things that happened since the 1970s did emerge out of Persepolis. So in my essay, I tried to show that things transpire differently from Imelda's cultural center and Kasaysayan ng Lahi and Farah Diba's enormous parade of Persia. But that's only two nodes. You've got Chile, you've got Nicaragua, you've got Cambodia happening at the same time. How do you wrap your head around this? But this is the reason why I have begun I began my writing and professional life thinking about power. And so I'm glad that cultural studies came along and it studies power. But of late, I've been actually focusing on complexity as a subject itself, as something. Of course, there's the complexity sciences, which helps a great deal, but not just complexity, not just complex thing and complex thing and what's the difference, but the orders of complexity, the the scale of density, which we need to wrap our heads around because we simply cannot understand the world right now. It really is, to me, a matter of getting annihilated if we cannot wrap ourselves around complexity itself. And if it was really hard to figure it out in the 1970s, it is. Well, we've got some serious thinking to do and serious action to perform.
Yeah, I mean, I thought the way that you talked about how, however you want to call this political opposition. I mean, fascism is, an easy, let's say, summation for it. But the fact that it's not so much that it's about the prohibition on certain activities or cultures, like that will be allowed to continue. And I think that's why it's interesting that you make reference to the 1970s in the Philippines and Iran, because it's just a reminder for all of us who weren't there, that sure, you can have this idea of certain historical regimes, but there was actually life continued under those regimes, and life might also be allowed to continue under whatever regimes will come or that we're already living under. But
Yes.
it's I think the important thing that you say at the very end is that it's about this defanging of ways of thinking and creating, so that and I think that's what I'm hearing you say now. Maybe that is what is different about today as opposed to the older.
We hope that doesn't happen again, because what I feel so terribly upset about is that all that conceptualism, all that utopianism. Of course, we know that utopianism is a dream. We know that, but part of us still go after utopian agendas. But let's set this aside. Let's just think of conceptualism of the 1970s as the critique of the art system, and why do we still have an art system that is market driven without being self-conscious of market forces? Why did we have, after the 70s, a huge amount of work in feminism, in civil rights, in race relations, and still end up with what's going on in the United States right now, with what's going on in the Philippines right now? How did we end up here when we thought, at least until about 5 years ago, that we had, in fact, built on ideas of emancipation, that we had built on post-colonial theory? We tried to build societies that were inclusive and participatory, in which you created systems to empower the little guys. How did we get back to where we are right now? And I think part of the reason is because the art defined the by talking constantly about experimentation, by uttering words like post-coloniality, by using the jargon, by creating it into jargon instead of political action of a very rigorous sort. We lost it. Uh, we exhausted utopian agendas. We allowed the words to be appropriated by people like Duterte and Trump, who speak who's borrowed and not borrowed, who's stolen post-colonial words. We allowed it to happen, and so we're back here. I'm not, overly pessimistic. I think this is I happen to think that this is like um, it's a dying beast that's being extremely violent at the moment. We did do something with all of the critiques of modernity that we engaged in the 1970s. We did do something. We did do something about feminism and the civil rights movement and race relations. It happened. Black Lives Matter. That's strong, but the reaction is unbelievable. And so the lesson to be learned is how you do not make art effete, because effete art is going to enable these things. Yeah, and that's what I said in the end of my book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's amazing that it really brings us to the present in this way that, I mean, maybe now 2 years after you'd given that paper, and or every day, let's say, it gets clearer and clearer. But
Yeah.
I guess these are just words that, or things that we need to think about. But I think what's interesting about the book as a whole is also that we get to experience like your journey through these different eras and through these different periods of time. So in a way, where the book starts is at a certain place in, your own personal life, but let's say also in your thinking, but also in the political context. And then, there's this, in a way, a voyage away from certain institutions and apparatuses of the state into, both more practical fields like your interest in crafts and more philosophical conversations about language and national identity. And then, right at the end, it's like it just comes home, to this place that is more familiar to us present. But
if I have a few more moments, do I have
sure.
a few more moments? I'd like to recall just a very tiny piece in the book, which is a review I did of Rustum Baruch's, and we began with Rustum, book, Another Asia, where he wrote about Rabindranath Tagore and Okakura, the Japanese curator, both constructing Asia at the beginning of the 20th century. And that Okakura Tagore had a niece who spoke Bengali and English. Of course, Tagore spoke Bengali, and Okakura spoke English and Japanese. And there was a love affair between Tagore's niece and Okakura, which carried on for quite a bit of time. And this brings me back to language and friendship. The lovers only communicated in English. It was the only possible language in which they could communicate, because obviously Okakura did not speak Bengali, and the woman whose name I forget right now does not speak Japanese. So it was a modern love, and modernity could not be carried in Bengali or Japanese. It could be carried and conveyed in English. And so to me, it's also the friendship between Rustum and myself, and Elena Mirano and myself. It is it's a finding of that space in which your possibilities can be expressed and can be realized. But it's all hemmed in by the barriers of language and culture and distance and institutions and all of that. It's a small space, isn't it? It was a space of love in a language that neither of them could speak very well. John, I'd like to end actually on that note.
I think that's a great place to end. I'm not seeing any immediate questions, so. But let's see. Comment from Peter. It says, fascinating, Marian, this rethinking the taxonomies of classification of art / craft / material visual culture. Would love to hear more. Do you see any potential across the region to build some momentum and more allies for this rethinking process?
Peter, I should certainly hope so. I am at liberty to announce that I am creating a new museum for the Cultural Center of the Philippines. They've just commissioned me. It is called 21 AM. I've named it 21 AM. It's a 21st century art museum. And it exists on 3 spaces. It exists completely online. It exists in one part of the Cultural Center building, and it also exists everywhere. Now, as you know, it is possible to do that and to create a new institution like that. But the most important thing is my brief when I was commissioned was to put together all of the collections of the Cultural Center. And they do have what is called an ethnographic collection, which I collected for the Cultural Center in 1986. So I'm familiar with that. And then there is their modern collection, and then there is their contemporary collection. And to put them all together in one accession system. So it gave me the opportunity to now rethink not only the categories, but the words, how you enter into the record. And do you still use the word craft as a category, as a descriptive word? So this is happening right now, Peter. And I would really like to have some conversations with museums around the region to see if this thing that I'm creating with my company, Dow Inc., it's a computer program. But as you know, the DNA of any museum is in the accession system. And that's where you can actually attend to the grain of classification and all of the political that happens as a result of the way you classify things. So yes, there's an opportunity. There's a line of flight.
I mean, congratulations. I think that's great news. And I think we'll all look forward to hearing more about it and hopefully seeing it in not too long.
Not too long. Well, online.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
The future. So, well, Marian, thank you so much for joining me and talking, and again, sharing so much about the things you think about and the things you're working on and the things you have written about. And we're lucky that this book exists and so many people work so hard to bring it together. And this book is available. So the NUS Press is also offering a 15% discount. So if you use the code ROCES15 at checkout, you will get a discount on the book. It's valid until October 4th. And you can also purchase the book through the ArtAsiaPacific website. And if you have other comments or questions, also, the ArtAsiaPacific Facebook page is there. And we will also, I think along with NUS Press, we'll also be sharing an edited version of this talk so that you can circulate it further to friends, family, and anybody who might be interested in hearing more from Marian and hearing more about the book, which is really an incredible book. So thank you, Marian.
Thank you, HG. Thank you, Peter.